here. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the cherished land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and also express our gratitude for all of us to be here, even virtually, to think about climate change. Massey is missing COP26. That's the event that we are doing this week. Many people were supposed to be in Glasgow this week to plan and commit, to act, to commit to act some more, and to continue to act on climate change. Because of COVID, it's not happening this year, but it will happen next year. And Massey wants to help Canada and its community be ready for this critical international discussion. I want to thank a senior fellow and former environmental commissioner for Ontario, Diane Sachs, and Bill Graham Center and Massey College resident visiting scholar in foreign and defense policy, Rosemary McCarney, for putting together this wonderful program. And I'm also grateful for the help of Abra Rissi, who will be the technical head behind this. Today we begin with an intergenerational discussion about climate change, and that's very dear to Massey's heart because Massey is the place for interactions of people, young and old, and ideas. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. So let me just pass the virtual microphone now to Rosemary McCartney, our Bill Graham Center resident and visiting scholar in foreign and defense policy. She brings to the role a fabulous career. She was Canada's ambassador to the United Nations and the Conference on Disarmament until the fall of 2019. But before that, her career has spanned many different areas: economy, law, academia, technology, and multilateral diplomacy in over 100 countries. It is truly wonderful to have her at the college. Rosemary.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and welcome to Massey College, everyone. Many thanks, Natalie, our principal of Massey College, for spearheading a strategy on climate change here, and then inviting Diane Sachs and I to lead it. This week, we all would have been at the opening of COP26, meant to take place in Scotland, but because of COVID-19, it was caused to be postponed like many important summits. So we decided Massey could do something about that. And so we designed a 5-part series, Massey is Missing COP26, to take place during the missing COP26 between November 9th and the 19th. The series we've designed will take us from a reflective look today, looking back on climate action, to international diplomacy, to a negotiation simulation, to financing a low to zero carbon world, to the powerful role that arts and culture can play in mobilizing public engagement on climate action. We will be joined by students and junior fellows and some of our most senior leaders and senior opinion leaders through the 5 sessions. We have a rich array of co-sponsors joining Massey College for the series: the David Suzuki Foundation, the Canadian International Council, the Royal Ontario Museum, the World Refugee and Migration Council, and the Graham Center for Contemporary History, all of whom have contributed their thinking and experience in planning the series. So welcome to Massey College for this armchair conversation. I'm seated here in the beautiful upper library at Massey. And behind me, the backdrop quite appropriately are the wisdom windows on a warm November day in Toronto. And I've asked our guests to imagine we're all sitting together having an important conversation on the climate change movement in our armchairs. So to kick things off, we brought 2 Canadian icons of social and political activism, Dr. David Suzuki, who is in Vancouver today, and the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy, who is joining us from Winnipeg. I'm sure they need little introduction, but it is worth reminding or remembering their decades of service and activism. The Honourable Lloyd Axworthy is the chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council, and today is one of Canada's leading voices on global migration and refugee protection. After a 27-year political career where he served as Minister of Foreign Affairs, a Minister of Employment and Immigration, among other postings, Lloyd Axworthy has continued to work extensively on human security, refugee protection, and human rights in Canada and around the world. He was presented with the Pearson Peace Medal by the Governor General of Canada in 2017. And as President and Vice Chancellor at the University of Winnipeg, he initiated programs for migrant and Aboriginal youth communities and continues to contribute internationally on a vast majority of boards and volunteer associations on the plight of the displaced and the dispossessed, which has been a consistent thread in his many decades of life. And Dr. David Suzuki is a scientist, a broadcaster, an author, and co-founder of the David Suzuki Foundation. He's a companion of the Order of Canada and a recipient of so many awards, UNESCO's Kalinga Prize for Science, the United Nations Environment Program Medal, and many, many more. He's a professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and holds 29 honorary doctorates from universities around the world. Most of us know him from television and the widely acclaimed The Nature of Things, original host of Quirks and Quarks, which I didn't know that before, but I always listen to it, so it's good to know where it began, as well as the acclaimed series, It's a Matter of Survival, and From Naked Ape to Super Species. He's written widely. His works include more than 55 books, 19 of them for children, which leads me to my co-moderator and also a panelist today. I'm joined by Sophia Mathur, who comes to us from Sudbury. And Sophia too needs little introduction. At 13, Sophia has taken the cause of climate action to the US Congress and the Canadian Parliament. She was the winner of the 2019 Canadian National Museum of Nature Inspiration Award and co-starred in the documentary Citizen Kid, Earth Comes First. And inspired by Greta Thunberg, Sophia began the first youth in the Americas to hold Fridays for Future strikes starting back in 2018. So thank you for joining me, Sophia, for this truly intergenerational dialogue. Our objectives for today in this conversation is to capture the experiences of two senior Canadian campaigners for social justice over many, many decades. Each has taken his energy and his passion along different and yet compelling pathways, and now in their 8th decade are discussing where those fundamental principles come together on climate change and climate action. We'll have a series of questions in 3 segments and then open it up for questions from our viewing audience and our other participants. And we would ask that you use the Q&A question platform at the bottom of the screen to pose your questions, and we'll try to collect them as I pose some preliminary questions to Lloyd, to David, and to Sophia. So let me start. Let me start with you, David. When you look back on a life of activism on issues that were not always popular or even well known in the earlier days, can you reflect, and I'm going to ask the same question of Lloyd, can you reflect a little bit on what kept you going, what slowed you down or got in your way? And I'd also like you to think, if you could share with us, what's bringing the two of you together now? David, I'll start with you.
Well, I'd actually prepared a speech about why climate change matters to all Canadians, which I thought was the big question in this session here. And I'd like to start by first saying I speak to you from the Coast Salish unceded traditional territory. And this is a land of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish people who've cared for this land and the waters for thousands of years. I'm not a climatologist, but like Greta Thunberg, I take science seriously by listening to what other scientists say. We've seen what the denial of science in the United States has done in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. So why does climate change matter to all Canadians? 1, Canada contributes disproportionately to global emissions, so we have a responsibility in a global problem. 2, Canada is a northern nation, and we are already warming at twice the global average, 3 times the average in the north. And we're already feeling the impact all across the country. Canada has the longest marine coastline of any nation in the world. So the effects of sea level rise will affect us more than any other nation. The ecological consequences of climate change are already being felt and will be catastrophic. Mountain pine beetle infestations have taken out billions of dollars of pine trees. Polar bears are in trouble because they don't have the ice to seek their prey. Glaciers are a major water source of communities across Canada. They're disappearing. Permafrost locks in methane and it's melting. Oceans are acidified, and I could go on and on. Our parks are being torn apart by the need for species to move as climate changes. And hundreds of millions of climate refugees are going to be driven out of their countries by the impact of climate change because they will not be able to survive in their homelands. And Canada will be one of the few places that will take them or can take them. The fossil fuel industry is an important part of our economy, but it holds politicians to ransom to prevent regulation and setting emission reduction targets. Yet the industry has known since the 1960s that burning fossil fuels was contributing to climate change. And instead of working to find alternate energy, they embarked on an expensive campaign of lying and deception so their profit line could continue to grow. As an elder, I have lived through Canada's history of dealing with climate change. Remember, the warming effect of greenhouse gases has been known since Joseph Fourier described it in 1824. So by the 1950s, climatology was a robust science and global warming was well described. I might say the term was switched from global warming to climate change because it has become clear that warming won't be equally expressed everywhere in the world as the planet's overall warming occurs. There will be areas that will be cooler, and so climate change is a better description. In the 1950s, Russian climatologist Mikhail Badiko, in his book, described positive feedback loops that could amplify the effects of human emissions, predicting the loss of Arctic sea ice would accelerate global warming, and he was right. In 1965, Frank Icard sounded the alarm, quote, "There is still time to save the world's people from the catastrophic consequence of pollution, but time is running out. Carbon dioxide is being added to Earth's atmosphere by the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas at such a rate that by the year 2000, the heat balance will be so modified as possibly to cause changes in climate beyond local or even national efforts." End of quote. Frank Icard was president of the American Petroleum Institute. In 1977, Exxon scientist James Black reported, "Mankind is influencing the global climate through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels." And by 1982, Exxon scientists warned avoiding potentially catastrophic events will require major reductions in fossil fuel combustion. So the evidence was out, the industry itself understood. And yet, by 1992, the American petroleum industry's position had changed to, quote, "It's not known for sure whether A, climate change is actually occurring, and B, if it is, whether humans really have an influence on it." In 1988, I want you to remember 300 climatologists, politicians, and activists met in Toronto. Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister, opened the session. Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway, followed. And James Hansen, the climatologist from the US, said human burning of fossil fuels was causing the warming we were seeing that year. Stephen Lewis was invited to be part of that whole conference. And at the end of it, the press release said, "Global warming is a threat second only to global nuclear war," and called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. That was it. That was the call. The science was in, and the target was set, 1988. Study after study in the United States, Sweden, Australia, and Canada showed that it was an achievable target and would realize billions in savings if that target was reached. But it would cost billions of dollars to start with up front. Canada did nothing. In 1992, Rio, at the conference there, the Earth Summit, asked for a stabilization of 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2000. Canada signed that declaration. We did nothing. In 1997, at Kyoto, the target for the industrialized world was to reduce emissions by 6% below 1990 levels by the years 2008 to 2012. Canada signed. We did nothing. In 2006 to 2015, Stephen Harper became our prime minister. He called for action on climate change, crazy economics. He said reducing emissions will destroy the economy. And so by saying that, he elevated the atmosphere that gives us air to breathe, that gives us weather, climate, and the seasons. He elevated the economy above that atmosphere. Canada did nothing. Harper then shifted the baseline for reduction. Everybody was saying reduce below 1990 levels. He shifted that to the year 2005, allowing 15 more years of emissions. Canada repeatedly earned fossil awards at the COP meetings. Until 2013 in Warsaw, Canada earned a lifetime unachievement fossil award. In 2011, Harper admitted Canada won't meet its Kyoto target and pulled our country out of the accord, the only country that signed Kyoto to do so. In 2015, Trudeau says Canada is back, signs the Paris Agreement to keep temperature rising more than 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2100. Trudeau said we must keep it much closer to 1.5. He was right. But Canada did nothing. In 2018, Trudeau buys a pipeline for $4.5 billion to increase production of tar sands oil on the ludicrous rationale that we have to increase oil production to get the tax revenues to afford to reduce emissions. In 2018, the IPCC special report said that a rise above 1.5 degrees will be catastrophic, and called for a 45% reduction by 2030 and 100% by 2050. The next day, marijuana became legal in Canada and pushed everything else out of the news. In May of 2019, the United Nations releases a report chronicling a terrifying rate of species extinction. The next day, Harry and Meghan had a baby, which got more reports in 1 week in the media than all reports on climate over an entire year. In June 2019, Canada's House of Commons passed by 186 yeas to 63 nays, a motion declaring a climate emergency. The only leader of a party present at the vote was Elizabeth May, head of the Greens. Nothing results. December 2019, Jonathan Wilkinson, our new environment minister, returned from COP25, touting net zero carbon emissions by 2050. How many elections will there be between 2020 and 2050? 8, 9, 10? How many politicians in office today will still be in office in 2050? None. So who is accountable? Who can we send to jail or fine for not meeting the target? Net zero by 2050 is no commitment at all. And that is Canada's entire history. So I join Greta in saying, don't tell us to have hope. Don't tell us all the wonderful things that we are doing and the targets that we are aiming for. There is only one criterion to judge, and that is whether emissions are rising or falling. Throughout this entire period since 1988, Canada's emissions have continued to rise. In March, Canada called for a lockdown to flatten the curve of the COVID pandemic, and within weeks, hundreds of billions were committed to help citizens and companies weather the crisis. I applaud the government's response. But why, oh why, can't we make the same commitments to the climate crisis?
Thank you very much, David. So Lloyd, David has outlined an historical arc that was just a great reminder to bring us to now where we are now. But the arc is a long one of early knowledge and early science, public warnings, and no action again and again and again. And now today we have more science, more knowledge. The warnings keep getting more dire. What's different now? Like, are you optimistic?
Well, let me start with first the appreciation to be invited to your session. I think it's a terrific idea that you're helping to fill a little bit of the vacuum, the absence of the COPs meeting. I attended a couple of those during my time, and I think what we miss is a little bit of the dynamic that went on in those meetings, where there was large-scale participation, not just of governments, but of civil societies, individuals, scientists. I mean, it really was a form of assembly. And I found at the time it sort of resonated with me, because to go to your original question, Rosemary, I kind of really started my sense of public awareness during the 60s when I was a graduate student in the United States. And there was a confluence of civil rights, war in Vietnam, clearly major questions about the role of institutions, the student movement. In my own university at Princeton, we were very active in trying to determine what role do students play in actually the governance of that institution. And I think that's where we're at today, to come to your question. We're at a confluence of climate change, as David has so eloquently demonstrated. We've got the epidemic, we've got a breakdown of governance, and increasingly we have the increasing sort of suppression and really subtraction of participation. I will remember very clearly, I guess, one phrase when I'd come back to Winnipeg during the summer breaks from university. I went to work for the Logan Neighborhood House, which is in downtown central Winnipeg. It was a neighborhood effort to deal with poverty and the social conditions, bad housing. And one time we had the opportunity to listen to Saul Alinsky. Some of you old timers would know he was really the father or the patron of participation. And he said the fundamental rule is that people have a right to participate in the decisions that affect them. To me, that's always been a mantra. It's got to be a very crucial part. And what I see today is, in a contradictory, paradoxical way, an increasing opportunity for that kind of networking and engagement and virtual discussion. At the same time, that same media is also becoming the vehicle or the platform for extremism, violence, uncivility. I mean, we see the two kind of working in tandem. But the point I want to emphasize is the pluses to that for young men and women today who are skilled and knowledgeable about how to flick on a Zoom meeting, which I'm not, this is a great chance, I think, to engage. But let me use an example quickly that you participated in through the Refugee Migration Council. We connected with several hundred women and girls around the world who were refugees or displaced persons, to ask them the question, how is COVID affecting them? And it was enlightening in the sense of how active and articulate and committed so many of these women were, but it was also really soul destroying to realize how much they had been forgotten. I remember this phrase forever, and that is that if you're a displaced person, you're at the end of the queue. You don't have a government representing you. And for all the decisions that are being made about remedies and vaccines and economic resilience and recovery, if you don't have anybody in that network, and governments right now have been increasingly looking inward, the problem that is arising is not only the direct impact, but also one that is now being interlaced with the climate impact, which is going to create large movements, both internally and internationally, of millions of people who can no longer have the ability to look after their families, to feed, to have water. And that also becomes a cesspool, a septic tank for generating more conflicts. You only have to look at what happened in Sudan, and you can see it today, still in parts of the world, where the increasing the conflict over who gets access to food. I mean, food security is becoming increasingly one of the existential problems of our time. And what I learned going back to that experience of the 60s, we had to kind of absorb the idea that you can't deal with these problems with one choir note. And that's what we're dealing with today. And about 2.5 years ago, David and I had the opportunity to meet at the University of Winnipeg. And we talked about how there had to be an increasing collaboration between the activism around climate change and the activism of providing for proper responsibility and rights for displaced persons and refugees. And that the constituencies of advocacy and activism had to find a way to start working together to provide a much broader coalition to start pushing the political systems towards getting their heads around the combinations and the integration of those issues. I think that's I don't want to sound too academic, because I'm not one anymore. I was for a period of time. I think that's one of the great intellectual questions of our time, is how do we get people to, and particularly translate that into integrated policy. And I think we're stumbling along in some ways, but the United Nations, to give you one example, has not yet been able to figure out how to put together the agencies working on climate, and the agencies working on development, and the agencies working on epidemics. And yet the scientific evidence is that increasingly the suppression of biodiversity and conservation is having a major impact on the creation of new opportunities for pathogens and toxins and epidemics to flourish. We have an example in our own Arctic North. Increasingly, we're seeing that as the permafrost melts, sort of toxins that have been frozen in the tundra for thousands of years in many cases are now beginning to emerge and getting in to the food chain. You have in Russia, where they were depositing anthrax sites during the Second World War for strategic purposes, is now beginning to reemerge because the massive melting that's going on. So here again is this confluence, this continuum. And I think one of the big issues that the next COPS meeting, and maybe that your particular 5-week program through Massey should begin looking at, is how do you provide the political capacity? Because I think the change that has to take place is only going to take place when there's a very large scale, broad public movement. I think we've seen one example of it just in the recent US election, where the people on the street, some marching for Black Lives Matter, others marching for women's rights, others marching on climate issues, and certainly around the epidemic, have all of a sudden begun to realize that as they came together, they could mount and get the power of the vote, the power of the ballot to go to work for them. Not perfect, but it sure as hell makes a big difference that Mr. Trump won't be there anymore.
Thank you, Lloyd. Let me bring Sophia into this conversation.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
great setup.
To me, it's a call to Sophia and her peers. But this is your time. But I think you also have to take, it's not good enough just to be on the street. You have to know why you're there and have some goals in mind And the toughest one is going to be is how do you provide partnerships and collaborations.
Right. And you know, I think both of you have touched on a little bit, how do we move from these discussions of exceptionalism in terms of both rapid onset and slow onset as something unusual, and we need to deal with that, not deal with climate change, it can wait, but rather how do we normalize that conversation and create the language? And Sophia, you know, your activism already and the peer group that you have built around the world is a little bit exceptional, and I think probably will help us with language. But you know, you've heard from David and Lloyd, they've been at it for decades and decades, you know, sounding the warnings, bringing the science, and not getting the action that it should have called for. You know, what, in terms of your activism, Sophia, you know, on the days when you have setbacks or there's just too many things moving way too slowly, as David and Lloyd have described, where do you get kind of that energy and commitment to keep going at it at 13?
Yeah, so I definitely seen, like, we've had a lot of setbacks, especially with COVID, because there was a big momentum growing. The climate movement was really big. There were millions of people out on the streets, and then suddenly this pandemic hit, and no one knew what to do. So here we decided to use our creativity and throw Zoom meetings, but it never felt the same. So how I deal with those setbacks is I try to remember the times when we used to be out on the streets and try to replicate that, because we can still make a difference without having big rallies. And I think that we can still have an impact over Zoom and on the internet, because we already were. Because when David and Lloyd were my age, there was no social media, but now we have social media to spread awareness, even though we are now in a pandemic. So I definitely think that dealing with setbacks is a lot easier now, and we can raise awareness, not just on the streets, but online too. So, yeah.
So when you listen to these two great campaigners for social justice, political activism, etc., what question would you like to ask of them?
So I would like to ask, what kind of advice do you have for young people like myself?
Would you like to start with David?
I think it's very sad.
David, you're on mute.
I think it's very sad that we have to look to youth to do what mom and dad are supposed to do. You know, at Sophia's age, you're going, you know, to high school, and you're making all kinds of new social relationships. Some of you may start dating and thinking about going to university. It's not what, this is what I said when I met Greta for the first time. I said, I am so sorry. This is not what youth are supposed to be doing. My generation, the boomers that followed, we didn't think about you. We just partied as if there was no tomorrow. We celebrated being out of the Great Depression, ended World War II, and boy, now growth and all this stuff. And we didn't think about the consequences. And so it's a very sad time that it has to be youth pleading for your future. You know, what a sad indictment of our species this is. It should not be Sophia or any youth's job to do this. And what I'm asking youth now is, for heaven's sakes, mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, your aunts and uncles, they love you, and they have to take what you're saying seriously, and they have to step up and be eco-warriors on your behalf. They've got to go and say, listen, what are you, your party, what are you doing, you politician? What are you doing about my child's future? Because if you don't put this as your highest priority, we're not going to have anything to do with you or your party. I think we've got to become a politically powerful movement. We've got to translate that energy of Sophia's generation. We've got to translate that into a huge political movement.
I think you're absolutely right. Certainly the climate crisis is a political crisis as well, and it's not separated. Lloyd, that's been your whole career, and what would you How do you respond to Sophia? How did you overcome that resistance as a political activist, using the political movement as a way to achieve social justice? So you're on mute, Lloyd.
Unmute. Right, there we go. I guess I would answer by coming back to a point I tried to make, that what the epidemic has given us a jolt, a shock to our system, is that we're faced with really almost a threat to humanity. We're beginning to realize what many generations, hundreds of years ago, learned, is that epidemics can wipe out half a population. And you combine that now with the climate change risks, you're now beginning that kind of issue that all of us have to start thinking about, whether we're theological or not. And that is, what are we doing in terms of the future of humanity? And I think that really, to me, is a mantra that needs to be put forward. I agree with David in this sense that there's no doubt that we're still playing by a lot of the old rules and conventions. And as someone who was in Canadian politics, provincially and federally, for 27 years, I was part of that game, although I think there's opportunities to do something incrementally about it along the way. I don't think we have that luxury anymore. I really think that where we're at, and looking at it from a very senior old fogey position, we're really at a stage now where the impetus for change simply means we can't go back and refurbish some of our old conventional wisdom. We really have to start thinking in a way about how do we provide a kind of much broader model in our minds, a way in which politics themselves have to work. And that is an area which I know we don't have time to get into, but the breakdown of governance in so many areas. And here's an example that I was talking with some friends of mine on the weekend about the results of the US election. And we realized that in many ways we have similar concerns about our own democracy. We haven't reformed our electoral system. I mean, it was promised in Mr. Trudeau's first term. It was dropped. And yet what we're realizing is it's discriminatory. It doesn't give full voice to people's concerns. And so when people go on the street, you also have to find a way of channeling that. And that would be, I suppose, partly the challenge I would raise with Sophie and her colleagues and friends. You have to have both an outside and an inside component. I guess my lesson was that I remember a friend of mine way back when brought me on the board of the folk festival in Winnipeg, and because he said I was the only guy he knew who had a suit. So when we had to go raise money, I had to do the inside job. And I was always conscious of the fact that, as a member of parliament, that I had to be in close touch with my community, constituency. And they very much drove the agendas. If you're not in touch with them, and I think so many, right now, politics is too much dominated by central executives. Parliament has really been downgraded. It's not given the respect or the opportunity. I think we need to look at some real reforms that we have to make. And here's where I don't agree with you. I think young people can drive that. I think that they certainly are showing, in so many respects, a much better sensitivity and awareness of what is going on. And I think, but also that they have the skills and the tools to mobilize the new technology to provide those kind of networks and collaborations that we need. We're talking about a network of democracy. Well, that really means opening up the opportunities. The UN hasn't figured out how to do it. Most governments haven't figured out how to do it. And yet I think that has got to be a base commitment as to how do you provide that combination of activism, and activism that translate into serious changes in both structural and policy terms in our governing structure. And I think that, and that's where I think maybe Sophie's generation and David's generation and your generation, I think we all have to come together on this.
You know, I think that you raised an important point, and that's why we want to have this intergenerational conversation, is that it's not going to be, there's not going to be one big ending. This is a lifelong commitment to climate action that there's no end point to this. It's forever. And so the generations will be important. But Sophia, just a couple of days ago in the New York Times, Greta Thunberg, who David and Lloyd have both mentioned, said, "Of course, I don't see the world in black and white. It's just that when it comes to the climate and environment, you can't be a little bit sustainable. Either you're sustainable or you're unsustainable." Would you like to comment on that? I know you and Greta speak regularly. Would you like to comment on that and kind of give some advice, because there's no halfway measures in this anymore, is there?
Yeah, and I'll say this really quick, but we can't just say that we are in a climate emergency and just acknowledge the fact that we are in a climate emergency and go partway solving it, because that still means we're in a climate emergency. You can't just acknowledge it, you have to take action. For example, a cancer patient will not just take part of the their treatment to be cured. They would take all of it. We need to do the same with the climate emergency. We need to take full action on this. And I do agree with Greta. You'd rather be sustainable or not be sustainable.
Right.
Look, we've run out of time. We have run out of time. We can't go on this way and say, oh, well, you know, we hope the democratic institutions and all of that. We've run out of time. We've already squandered 2 years of the 12 years the IPCC said we had a chance if we could get off our emissions by 50% by 2030. We've squandered 2 years, and there's no indication that we're serious about reduction. For Jonathan Wilkinson to come back and say net zero carbon by 2050 is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. We've got a climate emergency. And the only way that we can do something about this is to act as if this crisis with climate change is a global war. We've got to go to war. Seth Klein, Naomi Klein's brother, has written an excellent book called The Good War, in which he looks at what happened to Canada when World War II happened. We went from a third-rate country that was producing 40 airplanes a year to an aviation powerhouse. We were fourth largest aviation producer by the end of the war, 130,000 people employed in producing planes. And you look at the history of what we did. The government set up 28, what do you call them? Government organizations there, and they put a limit on profit. You couldn't profiteer from war, and everybody came together and put their effort in solving that. That's what we need. If we don't have that, all this incrementalism, forget it. Greta is saying it straight. Your emissions continue to climb. And that's the only criterion we have to say whether we're doing something about it.
Yeah, and especially because Canada has never met a climate target.
No.
So we continue to say that we're doing stuff, but all we're doing is honestly just acknowledging the fact that we're in a climate emergency, but we're running out of time. We don't have enough time to continue to say, yes, we are in a climate emergency, but we can't just continue to make excuses on the fact that we're not taking enough action.
And the overwhelming problem is the immense power of corporations. Corporations are driving it. I cited Frank Eichard just because it's important for people to know that the fossil fuel industry has known about climate change, has said that the effects, if we continue, will be catastrophic for humanity, and yet in the name of profit have lied. Exxon and the oil companies have spent not millions, not tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in a campaign to create confusion in the mind of the public. This is really, and yet no one's gone to jail for this. It should be a criminal offense, and the crime is that we're destroying a future for your generation, Sophia. That's what breaks my heart, is that Greta is right. Your future is at stake now. And yet, in order to serve those corporations, they're still at the table. We've had 25 COP meetings. What's the point of going to another COP meeting? Because the fossil fuel industry is a powerhouse at COP meetings. Believe it, they have had a huge impact on watering down anything coming out of COP.
Yeah.
Could I just make
One of
an
the
observation?
questions, oh, sorry, Lloyd. One of the
Well,
questions,
just to say,
many questions here.
Yeah, okay, I'll just make a very quick
Okay,
statement.
thank you.
I don't deny the urgency, but I do suggest that the way to deal with it is not to jump off the precipice, but to use the tools at hand and look at, as much as we may not be thrilled with democracy, the reality is it can work. And the power of the vote, of the ballot, needs to be mobilized. And I would go back to Sophie, for example. You're going to have an election in this country sometime in the next 6 to 8 months. How are you going to mobilize to deal with the kind of double standards and the lack of parliamentary accountability, the role of big money and corporations in making decisions? Those are all. I mean, I'm heavily involved in a program that, as Rosemary is, I'm dealing with the issue of corruption. With 20 and 30 billion dollars that are purloined around the world, they never get to the people who need it. And all of a sudden, you solve that, and all of a sudden you've now been able to redirect massive resources into investments on green technology, on redoing our forests. So I'm saying, let's not give up on that system, because the opposite is that you can easily tip the system. It becomes authoritarian and autocratic, and we might get more Trumps and Bolsonaros and Putins and Xi Jinping's. That, to me, as somebody who is who's not a Democrat as I am a socially committed, means I still think it's the solution.
Lloyd, we had 9.5 years of a Harper government that denied the reality of climate change, did everything they could to keep climate from even being discussed. Okay, so when Mr. Trudeau came in, we celebrated. He went to Paris. He said Canada's back. I emailed him. I said, you signed
but
on.
David, listen to me. Well, I said, I think we're at a juncture point now. Unlike getting rid of a particular administration, I think that the degree of risk that we all face is beginning to change the outlook. I mean, there's that old story about the black swans who arrive and that they overtake all the conventional ways of thinking and acting. I think we're at a black swan movement and timing right now.
Can I move? We have so many participant questions. I'm going to try and collect them a little bit. And they've come on the chat room as well as the Q&A platform. But let me start with one that touches on a bit of this debate that the three of you are having right now. And Lloyd, you talked about, and this is from Tom Cullen, you talked about the confluence of issues: COVID, social justice, BLM, poverty, climate. And so there's some strength in co-benefits of these codependencies without question. But I'd like to ask you and Sophia, and then I'm going to come back to David on another one. Is there a risk of dilution of focus when you're trying to pull multiple issues together, or even multiple levels of expertise?
I think really there's an old adage that in numbers there is strength. And I think that the more people you can find combining there, I'm not saying that they live and breathe 24 hours, but I'm simply saying, I think we have to find first a framework, a paradigm, if you like, in which we begin to see how these particular massive risks that we're now facing as a globe need to be related and connected. And in some ways it's happening. We're now talking that one of the responses to the COVID emergency is to have a much stronger emphasis on the green recovery. You've also had the impact where the big oil companies are now falling off the Forbes 100 list because they no longer have the clout they used to have. I mean, I think things are changing, but we haven't had a catalytic leadership. And it may just be, I mean, if you leave a 78-year-old new president, it may just be provide the opportunity for that to happen. And I think it all depends on what other kinds of people come to this table with them. And that really means, because I'm thinking as a Canadian, I think we have to I mean, we're all saying, oh, thank God, we don't have Trump to deal with, but Trump was simply a reflection of a much stronger distemper taking place. We have to guard against that happening in our country, but we also have to use this period to really break out of the conventional wisdom. Will that happen or not? I go back to the point I raised with Sophie. You've got an election coming up, use it.
So, Sophia, let me ask a question of you from the Q&A platform. And one of the questions that I think is an important one for climate activists like yourself is that it's a little bit about, your focus is on climate action. Lloyd responded to that question of, creating a broad tent for more people to come in. But how do you overcome the fear and resistance of the adults that you're trying to bring along to losing their jobs or losing ways of life, et cetera, in a resource-rich country like Canada? How do you have those conversations with your peer group about how to overcome resistance and in fact engage more people in what you're trying to achieve?
Well, as one of the questions said, is the climate crisis is a Black Lives Matter issue. It's a women's rights issue. It's going to affect everyone if we don't take action. So if we don't take action on this, it will affect your jobs and your money, which is clearly what a lot of adults care about right now. And as a kid, all I can see is that you're not taking action on this. I've never dealt with job issues. I haven't gone to university yet. I haven't paid taxes yet. All I know is that we are in a climate emergency. And if we don't take action on this, I won't be able to have a job in the future. I won't be able to live the luxury life that most adults are living today, because I'll be worried about the fact that my children won't be able to be safe and have to be worrying about this. So I think that you say that you love your children a lot, and a lot of parents do, but yet a lot of adults are still not taking action on this, and they're putting money above their own children.
David, a question for you. It's from Roy Culpepper, and it's current events. You've given us this incredible arc of history, but we had a major event happen over the weekend, or still playing out, with the new Biden administration. And the question is, should Canada be working on a common front with the incoming Biden administration on the climate emergency? Do you see possibility there?
Well, if the United States would declare war, I suspect, that of course I have no fingernails left from watching that election, but that is a country in which there is not going to be the leadership because it's a divided country. And I hope that Biden is able to reach out and bring the other side across. That's going to be a big challenge. And there are two things that I think are really challenging in the United States. One is an enormous power of corporations, which is, the wealth of the United States is just concentrated in a very, very few hands. And that's got to be busted up. It's just wrong. But the other problem, I've forgotten what the hell the other problem was. That's the biggest problem of all. But I think that Canada has just got to get on with doing what it can now. We've got to start bringing emissions down. Stop looking to that partnership. We are a very different country. I got all my post-secondary education in the United States at a time when there were jobs, and this was during the Cold War, when they were trying to get to the moon before the Russians, and it was a very exciting time to be in science. I came back to Canada because Canada was different, and I didn't like the values that Americans had. Let's concentrate on getting our act together, and we got to start very, very quickly. Our problem is this is an unprecedented situation. Our species, we're a local tribal animal. For 99% of our existence, we existed as local tribal animals. And look at the history in Canada before colonization and settlers came. people lived in place for thousands of years. They worked things out. But now we're dealing with a globalized species. We are empowered with enormous amounts of technology, a tremendous consumptive appetite. And we're trying to deal with an unprecedented situation where we've never had to deal together as a single species. The only time we ever do that is in science fiction movies, when an alien from outer space comes to Earth and starts killing people randomly. Well, guess what? The American president's calling the Russians, calling the Chinese. That's when we get together. Well, that's what we face now, except it isn't an alien invader, it's us. But anybody that thinks that we're going to be able to sustain the life that we have, and a lot of environmentalists think, well, if we get LED lights and we drive electric cars and we take the bus more, well, we'll be able to live like this. No, we will not. We are so far above the capacity of this planet to sustain people. We've got to reduce our demands of Mother Earth. And I spent 7 months in lockdown on an island in my cabin. And wow, it was, for 6 months, I had 3 grandchildren and their parents with us. It was the happiest time of my life. No cell phones, we had no television, no newspapers. And I'm going, what the hell are we running around for all this stuff for? We've got to find a way of living differently. I think we have an opportunity. This must not be coming out of COVID. We must not start saying, oh, it's climate change. That's the issue. It's all of these issues. As Sophia said, it's questions of women's role in society. I think they should be leaders, Indigenous people and their positions, the poor and hungry. All of these issues, we need a just, more equitable, and a green way of living in the future. And it's going to be radically different, but the quality of life, believe me, is going to be much greater. And I don't think it's fair to ask Sophie, what do you think we should do? Or what about the jobs and all that? That's not their, I mean, it's ludicrous for us to ask her to come up with answers to those questions. She's just telling us.
But and yet, Sophia will need to overcome resistance, because the resistance may be changing, but she will, as an activist, still have to overcome resistance. And certainly from the evidence on the streets with youth activism on the climate crisis, you're bringing more and more people on board. Sophia, I'm going to give the last word to you.
All right. So thank you everyone for being here. It's been such an honor to talk to you and see all the questions run through the Q&A section, because I'm looking through that and I don't know. I guess, should I ask one more question or?
No, I think if you can have the very last word. What do you want us to do? Get involved with you?
So as a youth, I'm telling you that we are in a climate emergency and we need to act on this. We need to stop waiting around. And I think it is essential that we talk about this, but we have to remember that right after this call, when everyone's off their Zoom meeting, we can't just forget about everything that was discussed today. And we need to actually take action on this. But it's been such an honor to talk with all 3 of you, and also see all the questions just running through the chat and through the Q&A panel. So thank you for letting me speak. Thank you.
Well, and I appreciate the many questions that were in the Q&A and on the chat room. And we're going to continue with this after the series. In the new year, we will be continuing with a series of webinars on climate action and kind of taking it up a notch and going down deeper into some of these things. I think the 2 of the questions that seem to the themes would be around David's point: how do we hold people and institutions and banks and so on and so forth accountable? And, in Lloyd's and Sophia talking about how do we get more engagement, more committed and sustained engagement on these issues. And so my takeaway from this, and I thank you all very, very much for it, and everyone listening in, is the need for relentless leadership on this issue. And certainly Dave and Lloyd have shown that they're relentless in terms of their leadership. And Sophia, I can see you coming in their wake without question in terms of the tenacity and commitment that you're already showing on climate crisis. Thank you all very much. I hope you keep tuning into the next webinar on Thursday, where we'll start to talk a little bit about international diplomacy with Kathleen Wynne. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.